Greetings. The title of this talk is A Passage Through Self or Consciousness. It is a talk that I've given for the last 8 or 10 years, and I've given it almost 70 times, and now I'm tired of this repetition. So today we're fixing it on tape. Thanks to my friend in front of me, George Sanchez, who's taking this tape, or making it for us. One of the early fathers of the church noted or made the comment that nobody really knows the descending path of how we came from God. In other words, how we came, that path by which we came here into the present. But he did say that everybody knows the way back. We know the ascending path. And so this is a rather important observation, because we have all kinds of theories and speculations and ideas about how we got here, that were for a descending path. But he said that will always be just guesswork and speculation and theory. Whereas we do know, however, our ascending path. And this, of course, he felt was revealed by Christ. The observation is also important because it points out the fact that we come into the world unknowing. We don't really know how we got here. And that we return to God knowing. So we come unknowing and return knowing. That is a big difference between our coming and our going. Now, in giving this talk, what I'm going to give here is the ascending path. And I'm going to do it using a series of circles. These circles, the idea of using this as a model, simply came from my own experiences. The circles do not represent anybody's philosophy or theology or psychology. It's not based on theory. It is not speculation. Rather, it is taken from my own experiences, and as we go along, I think that you'll find that out. But before we begin, I would like to make a few comments. First of all, I have found out that people come to these talks with certain expectations and ideas in their mind about what self is. And this becomes a hindrance to really focusing in or concentrating to the model that I present. For example, some people just a priori or come with the supposition that self is God, that self is divine, that it is the absolute, that it is eternal. Some people regard it as the most overpowering archetype of the unconscious. Some people say that self is just an idea in our heads, and a wrong idea, it's a delusion, it's false. Some people say it doesn't exist. Some people think that self is their soul, the totality of their existence. And so they come with these expectations and ideas. And when that is not what I learned about self, and that's not what I present, then their minds begin to fight it. The mind immediately starts arguing with itself and debating and being contradicted, and so they don't really hear what I am presenting, which is basically very new. It's very new and different. And so the real challenge of hearing and listening to this new paradigm of our spiritual passage and of the nature of self or consciousness is to try and put aside, for at least the space this tape, to put aside our preconceived ideas and notions. Otherwise, you're not going to really hear it and not understand. It follows through, it has a logic, what I present has a logic of its own, but you're not going to be able to follow it if your mind is always arguing. And in a way, we have to have, when we say an open mind, we mean putting aside, at least for a while, our own ideas about things so we can let in something new. After that, when we're through, in fact, usually when I'm through with this talk, I always say, now forget it, throw it away. If it's going to be of any use to you, well, you've now heard it, and now God could use that down the road, possibly, if it's going to be of any use to you or prove insightful in any way. Otherwise, it's not a piece of theology to be memorized. I don't want people accepting it as, although I regard it, this journey that I'm going to present, as basically very universal, really applicable to everybody. I don't expect other people to see that or to believe that. I've always said the truth of things is, anyway, the truth is unbelievable. So I'm going to ask you to, in order to be able to understand it, to give it a little space of its own. That we really want to begin the journey before there was any self around, before man even was around. And what was around before self? Well, we know that there are different dimensions of existence. For example, there's that elementary level of existence, the elements themselves. And then, of course, there is that biological or vegetative dimension of existence, the plants. And then there is the sensory dimension of existence with that whole neurological system, which is the senses, which is the animals who can see and hear and touch. And then, of course, and that is its own dimension of existence. And then there is the human dimension of existence, which is noted for being a dimension of consciousness, a dimension of self. So man really represents one dimension of existence, the animal another, plant, and the elements. And God, of course, is another dimension of existence. Early on, the Greek philosophers recognized that man was a microcosm, recognized that man was composed of all lower dimensions of existence. And after he realized that, he then could ponder, after he got that straight, he could then ponder if there was anything beyond his own dimension. You know, is there, and if so, could man attain or reach that dimension? And of course, this is where we're getting into the man's spiritual journey, because he can go beyond his own dimension, or ultimately he is destined to. My point is that what man, his real uniqueness is, what his essence is, as I say, is self or consciousness. He's not unique by reason of his senses, or he is not just a sensory being, he's not just an animal, he is not just a vegetative body, and he's not just a conglomeration of elements. Man is most uniquely and in his own right a conscious being. When God reveals himself to man, he's not going to reveal himself to, to our senses. God is not going to be something that we see and hear and touch. Rather, God reveals himself to consciousness, because that is our uniqueness by which, and that is the medium by which man is touched by God. Before we can actually start the journey, we have to say what self is, or consciousness is. And the reason for saying that consciousness and self are the same thing is because we cannot say anything about self that we don't say about consciousness. What we say about consciousness, we say about self. So these are identical terms, and so they don't define each other. Two identical terms do not define one another. And so we have to define, so we're going to define self. Now, self cannot be known, as I've said, so long as we are living it or are it. Self is really, at least the totality of self, is only known once it is gone, in its absence. We know it by what is not there anymore, what is not functioning, what is absent, and so forth. That is how we at least know the totality of self. Self is also, first and foremost, an experience. It is not an idea in our heads. You see, before we can have any idea of self, it must first be an experiential reality. Otherwise, the term self would never have arisen. Where did we get the idea of self from? Some people say it's a false idea, but where did we get it from? We get it from our experience. Self, in fact, is man's most immediate experience. And I repeat that. Self is man's most immediate experience. Everything else is mediated experience. But unmediated experience, or the most mediated experience, is, or how should we say that? It's the most unmediated experience, is self. All other experiences are mediated through self. We said we wanted to start before man was around. And so we're going to start with the animal. And let us say that for right now, let us say that this circle represents the animal's brain. He is the center and all of his neurological system. And this is a sensory brain, and only a sensory brain. In other words, it only, as it were, looks outward and takes in, and here I say looks outward, and it takes in and responds to everything that's coming inward, everything that touches it. And this is the animal's sensory brain. And I've often thought, what would it take to go from this step, the animal, if God wanted to create man, what would he have to do? What is it, the next step, you might say? You know, it is so clever and so ingenious. Of course, every creative act of God is. And it's also extremely simple. You know, without any lightning or thunder. All God really had to do was to take this sensory brain and bend it on itself. And now the animal, and this is no longer an animal, now the sensory brain not only looks outward and responds to what is outward, in the bending of this brain, now what does it see? It sees itself. And voila, self is born, consciousness is born. And let me say right here, I'd like to make a comment here that there really is no such thing as evolution as such, or at least as we usually understand it. You see, whatever gradations or the ordering of the universe there is, nothing new comes into existence without God's creative act. Very simple act, to go from one flower to another flower, one species to another. God need only just alter maybe a chromosome, alter a few cells, very silent, very quiet. But you see, what we see is something new coming forth. And that's what we call evolution, is the change we see. You know, it's like the creative act reminds me of dropping a bomb, you see. Now, we don't know, we didn't actually see that bomb hit the ground. We didn't even know it was coming. But we all stand there and we marvel at all the change that it brings about. The whole terrain changes, you see. So the problem is that with the idea of evolution is that we can't catch God in the act. God acts as instantaneous, a divine act. And I have experienced myself as instantaneous. And at first we don't know, we're aware of that, but we don't know what has changed. We don't know what has happened. Time will show us that. We will experience that change. But in the immediacy of it, we just don't know. We know there's been a change, we're not really sure what. So for God, so strictly speaking, in the strict sense, there is no such thing as evolution. Because every change, everything is brought about by creative act. Only it's just that we cannot catch God in the act because it's so swift and so fast. And maybe some of you have had that experience where you know there's a sudden change, but you don't know what. At that moment, you don't know what that was. It's only in retrospect, when all the dust has settled, you might say, that now we notice the change. So now I'm not saying that this was exactly how man came to be, but we do have a sensory brain, and this and the fact that it's bending on itself is what gives us consciousness or self. The animals are not conscious beings. They are not aware of themselves. Their senses look outward. The senses have a wisdom of their own. Let's not underrate the animal sensory system. It is still a mystery to us. It is that profound. But many people are upset when you say that animals have no consciousness. And to those people I say, don't worry. Everything that God has made knows its maker. All things know their maker. So don't worry about the animals. They have a different way of knowing, and God only knows how they know God. And the plants, the elements, all things know their maker. Now, man's specific way of knowing his maker, though, is going to be through consciousness, because this is how God made it to be. And this is our dimension, our communication with God is consciousness or self. So now we no longer have this, this is no longer just a sensory brain. And always try to keep in mind that when talking about, whenever I'm using a circle, this mind is constantly bending on itself. And I call this, which is the knowing self. Now, consciousness consists of two different dimensions of experience. And one dimension alone, which we're going to talk about first, is the knowing self. Now, on an unconscious level, I mean you're not normally aware of it, this mind is always bending on itself. And what consciousness really is more than anything else is the act of bending. Consciousness is a dynamic thing. It isn't just staring at ourselves. It's the very act of the mind bending on itself, which is the kind of the essence, or the, in other words, consciousness is an act. It's not just a thing. It's a dynamic act. And in this act, the mind bends on itself. And in bending on itself, knows itself. And here we get the term self. Here we look at but on the unconscious level, it is constantly bending on itself, which is why I call it reflexive. This is an autonomous mechanism. It's not under our control. We did not choose to be human. This is what it means to be human, is to have or be really reflexive consciousness. And so, like a muscle, it is a reflexive mechanism. And that's, and I really want to stress the word reflex, because that is the nature of the unconscious level. Now, when we talk about the conscious level, or when we are aware of our own self-awareness, when we become aware, you might say, of this reflexive being that we are, then we come to the conscious level of consciousness, and I call that the reflective level of consciousness. And we do have some control over this reflective level. We can choose to look inward, look at ourselves, kind of a self-examination, or we can choose not to. And but on an unconscious level, we don't have that choice. The mind is always bending on itself. Now, this is very important to understand, because in many of these meditative techniques, in the meditative techniques that we hear about, quieting the mind, and many people claim that they're no longer aware of themselves and so on. That we can actually, with practice, have some control over this reflective level. We can become so silent and in a way no longer really looking at ourselves. That, however, the reflexive level of consciousness is going right on. So later on we will talk about this experience and reality that we call ecstasy. But for right now, I just want to get across that consciousness is composed of the knowing self has two different levels. One is the unconscious level and one is the conscious level. But altogether, I just call it consciousness. And altogether, I just call it self. So we're aware of ourselves all the time, whether we're aware of it or not. We are aware of ourselves. And it doesn't matter. It also, as we can see, because of this reflexive mechanism, consciousness is dual. The knowing self, anyway, is a dual system. Because the way we know ourselves is an object to ourselves. And it doesn't matter which side we say is the subjective side, because they're identical. The subject is the object here. We often hear this idea that the subject is the object, but this only refers to consciousness, to self. The primary object of consciousness is always itself. The primary object of self is always self. So it doesn't matter whether we call it subject or object. Many people make a mistake. They mistake what we might call a sensory object, like a stone or a table, and then they say, well, here I'm the subject and that's the object, but they're not identical. This is a mistake. They're not identical. What is identical, however, is the subject and object of consciousness. They are the same thing. And that's the first thing we see, is this subject and object of consciousness. So the object is just the subjective, is the objective. This is just the objective self and the subjective self. How have I put that in the past? This is just the subject objectified, you might say. Some woman, when I was going over this demonstration, she said she was a biologist and zoologist, and she said she really understood this, had a feeling for this reflexive mechanism, and she kind of made the gesture this way, you see. And her idea was that what this mechanism is, and I don't know on a biological level what it is, that it's the exchange, that it's one side of the brain knowing and seeing each other, seeing one another. It's the exchange between the two. You see, now I don't know how that works, but somehow it made sense to her. And as I say, I'm not interested in the biological aspect of it, except that this knowing self, and the fact it is dualistic, is simply our experience. Nothing is more immediate, than, hey, what am I or who am I? Well, I'm myself. But consciousness has a different dimension, a second dimension. And that is the energy and what we will call the center of consciousness. And that other dimension is what we call the feeling dimension. So consciousness consists of a feeling dimension, which is located basically at the center of consciousness. And then it has a knowing dimension. And between this knowing and feeling, it encompasses the totality of all our human experiences. And we're going to go into that. Now, in order for this mechanism to run, you might say, to keep this little machine going, if we can put it that way, you need some fuel. You need a specific energy. And this energy is that other dimension of consciousness, the feeling self. And it seems to be located not up here in our minds, but if you could silent the mind, somehow we're carried down to an energy center. I just call it below the neck. I think Carl Jung was right. This little dot in the center of the circle, by the way, is what I refer to as the center of consciousness. And I think Carl Jung was right when he located or suggested that the center of consciousness was equivalent to the body's center of gravity, which means that depending on our bodily build, maybe, each person may experience a little different center of himself or center of gravity. The reason why I agree with Jung on this fact, because if there were no self, you see, there is like a release from gravity, and there becomes the experience of such lightness, like floating. One feels that they're floating. There's also a sense of bodilessness without this center of gravity, which is equally the center of consciousness. So whether people want to locate it in their heart, which strikes me as more a place for the sentiments, some people locate it more towards the navel. And one time, some years ago, I picked up a book called Hara by a German philosopher by the name, or psychologist, by the name of von Durkheim. I believe that was his name. And he had been to Japan and picked up on their term Hara. I'm not too sure what the Japanese mean by that term, but it's a gut level experience. And but from what he said about it in his book, I instantly knew this, instantly recognized it through my own experience as really being the center of consciousness. So let us talk about some of those experiences for which this center is responsible. First of all, it is an energy center, and it is that energy that's going to run or propel the reflexive mechanism of the mind. And it is an energy that is specific to consciousness. In other words, it's not the energy that runs the senses. It's not the energy, whatever energy it is, that runs our biological system, or the cellular or subatomic system. It's not that energy. This energy we're talking about, or this other dimension, second dimension of consciousness, is specific to consciousness. So that if you were to be without self or without consciousness, this energy would disappear. But the energy remains for the body, the senses, and life goes on, just put it that way. But we don't know that. So long as we are living self-consciousness, so long as we are that, we do not realize that. For many, this center of energy seems to be, we experience it as the center of life. It is a life force. We experience that center as life, as being, as existence. That is located right here. Even if, I would say if you could even stop your mind, it will be there. And it's a subtle experience, and this is probably one of the first things that we do in the spiritual life is make contact. In silencing ourselves, we will contact this center of our being, and we're going to talk more about that. So this center, the experience of this center is the experience of life, of being. Being is much more of a silent experience. Life is more dynamic. But the center of consciousness is all this. And it is experience of we don't realize it until afterwards, but it's the experience of having a soul, of being a soul. It is also the experience of being a bodily entity. We don't usually realize that. Now, up one from there is the experience of willpower, of will, volition. It's a powerhouse. The center of consciousness is a powerhouse. And up from there, up from will, we get into the whole affective system. All those feelings, love and hate, fear, anxiety, what joy, whatever it is. And up from there, we have all these very subtle experiences of various sentiments. Pity and compassion, gentleness, and we have also some experiences we don't even equate with consciousness or self. And that, like being tired, being bored, a sense of serenity, calmness, all of this is due to that center of consciousness. This is the feeling self, the experiential self. And this, as we said, reflecting this fuel, you might say, also causes the reflexive mechanism of the mind. Now, I don't find anything particularly mysterious here about this reflexive mechanism, but there is definitely something very mysterious about that center of consciousness and all that that means. But put these two together, the knowing self and the experiencing self, and we have the totality of the purely human experience. Sure, we can still taste and we can still hear, which is the senses, but that's not what's unique about us. As we know, who was it? Helen Keller. All she could do, I guess, was touch. But what a magnificent mind she had. Full consciousness. She really taught us something. That with the minimalist, even despite the minimal use of the senses, consciousness is so superior to it. At the same time, it may come as a surprise to some people that man can actually live without consciousness because of the senses, you see. But neither man nor animal can live without the senses. So now, also, one more point, a very important point I have to make, is that you see this pinhole that I've said is the center of consciousness. If you put this, if I put this to my eye here, I can actually look through it. And which means that consciousness is open-ended. It has an openness in itself. And if we could look through this hole in ourselves, if we could look down into the deepest point of our being, and the deepest point of our being is the center of consciousness. If we could look down into it, do you know, we might find this little peephole and be able to look through it. And what would we see if we looked through that peephole? In this creative act of God having created consciousness, he knew that man could not see. We say that God is everywhere, but man can't see everywhere. He can't see it with his senses, and he can't see it with consciousness. So in order to be able to see God, you might say, be aware of God, as it were, covered up everything, covered up himself. This is just a way of putting it. It's not the reality. But it's like consciousness. Say that everything out here is God. But consciousness is like a veil over God that he puts in front of him and leaves only a little peephole in the center. So that now, looking deep into ourselves, or later looking out, we can actually focus on God. You see, if God's everywhere, we can't focus on God. You know, the idea, many people, when you approach them about religion, they always say, well, God's everywhere, so I don't have to go to church, I don't need religion, God's everywhere. So it's a cliche, because they don't really see God everywhere. If you ask them, well, what do they see when they see God everywhere? Well, they'll start stuttering around, and usually it comes down to some mundane thing, like when you give some money to a beggar. Well, I certainly think that that's a manifestation of man's goodness and of God, but you're really not seeing God. And above all, you're not seeing him everywhere, because that's just a very specific incidence of how man can manifest God in his life. But to really see God, to be able to focus on God, you see, God consciousness can do this because of this center. We can look through this center. It's like looking through a microscope or a telescope. The sky is so vast we can't take it all in. But if with our telescope we can focus in, you see, and now we see the marvelous. Now we don't mistake one thing for another. Now we can focus on God. So this little peephole in the center of consciousness, if we look, we will find God there. And if we could look out through the people, then we can begin to see how God is everywhere. It's like an hourglass. You have a tiny hole by which you spot God. And if you could see out there, then it becomes vast. So that's how man really sees God. It's not by looking all around. We can look and look and look. And God is everywhere, but we're not going to see it. So this people is going to be man's particular way of seeing God, knowing God. And as we'll see, of God's knowing us and contacting us. So that also lies underneath, you might say, the center of consciousness. Now, so far I've only used this side of the card, but now I want to turn it around. And you'll see I have made a circle around this people. And what this circle is what I call the ego. That within this whole little center here is what I call the ego center. And this is man's, what you might say, original consciousness. Now, it means that all of consciousness is centered around ourself. So the ego then is being for itself. It's wanting our own will. It's pursuing our own good. It is our own self-enhancement. And obviously it's the totality of consciousness. It isn't just some little ego. Many people think that there's all of consciousness and then there's the ego. But you see, this is our original consciousness. And even though later on we'll look back and say that this was an immature consciousness, and to some extent it is, nevertheless, this is how things are to begin with. It is the first real or deepest self that we encounter. Now, many people, many people have the wrong idea about the ego self. Many people refer to it as the false self, but there's nothing false about it. It is real, and it is important. It's our dynamic energy center. The ego is that in man which goes in pursuit of God, his highest good. The ego is the state of the freest will that we'll ever have. And I want to say something about this misnomer that people have, that the ego is bad or that it is false. Let us say what we mean by false self. And I'm going to take this from examples in my own life. Starting at about the age of 3, I began to fight my mother just to be able to be myself. She was always saying to me, for example, now I want you to be a nice girl. If you're not good, nobody's going to like you. I want you to be this way, or you ought to be that way. And I used to say, hey, how can I be anybody but myself? I'm just myself. You know, what she seemed to me, what she wanted me to be, was she wanted to make me over into her own image and likeness. And I used to say to her, who do you want me to be? It's Shirley Temple. So my mother and I, starting at the age of 3, we went at it. Finally, when I was about 7 or 8, she gave up because I was determined simply to be myself. Now, looking back, I can see how people, this can take on a false self by trying to be what other people think they should be, by allowing other people to mold you according to their image of you. Why, you're trying to, they have an image of you and you're trying to live up to it. And in doing that, you try to please others, and you're not being true to yourself. So this is what we mean by the false self. It means taking on other people's images of you, and not looking deep into yourself, and having your own image of yourself, which means in a way having no image of ourselves. because we are just ourselves. So the ego in itself is strong, and it is that which says, hey, I am myself. The ego, remember, is deep in the center of ourselves. This isn't some peripheral little false image of ourselves. This is our true self. It's this, the ego gives man, it's responsible for man's sense of his worth, his being unique, individual, distinct, having a mind of his own, a being of his own. It means standing tall, accepting responsibility. It means striving to be good. All this, that's what the ego is. And it is, basically, it is good. Now, if there's any problem with the ego, is that it can go either way. It has free will. It can either go in pursuit of the highest good, or it can go in pursuit of what is less than good. And when I say go in pursuit of good, I mean good for itself. And let's face it, nothing's better for us than God. Nothing's better for us than goodness. And all those virtues. And who's going and seeking? Who's going in pursuit of that? Where's all that energy coming from? That is the ego. So the ego is the powerhouse for goodness. The problem is it can also go the other way. It can become a powerhouse for downright evil. I cannot think of any evil in the world for which man is not responsible. And so this ego and all this energy here is responsible for both the greatest good in the world and for the greatest evil in the world. So the problem with the ego is that it is not stable, because it can go either way. Today we may want to be good and go in pursuit, and maybe this pursuit of goodness will last a few weeks, a month, a year, and then there's a reverse. So the ego is just not that stable. And if we're going to transcend the ego, it isn't because it is bad, but because it is not stable in goodness. Many people think they know what the ego is, but the ego, like all self-consciousness, is only known when it's gone. It's known in retrospect. And so all our ideas about the ego are probably, most of them are false. It's only when that ego falls away that we really know what that ego is. And it's why I say that it is being primarily for itself. It is not being for God. It is being for itself. And in fact, the reason why we go in search of God is, frankly, for ourselves, for our own good. And we can say, well, is that a self-centered, egotistical thing to do? Yeah, but it's the best thing that we can do, is that, is to go in pursuit for our own sake, first of all, because we cannot help others unless we are first help ourselves. And so it really starts with ourselves, and we pursue God for our own good, not for somebody else's good. And that's what the ego does. That's its function. So the totality of consciousness then is what we can call egoic consciousness. And this is our original consciousness. And as I always experienced it, God, I realized the center of myself. And I always saw that God was, as it were, below it. And so one of the paradoxes, you might say, of the journey is that to get out, ultimately, to get out of self, we have to go through self. And that means we go inward. So it's a rather a paradox to say that we go out of self by going inward, because we go outward by making the journey through self. So let us start now with the journey itself. Let us say, now we're going to have to take some things for granted here. Let us say that we have have gone in pursuit of God. But how, and it usually entails, what really starts the journey. I've never heard of a single situation of anybody really beginning their spiritual journey in earnest who has not had some unlooked for or very sudden experience of God. Whether it comes through some crisis in life, whether it just comes out of the blue for no apparent reason, those factors are not important. The fact is we feel touched by God, that God has revealed himself to us. And I would like to also, some people are not too aware of that center of being. They say, well, I have never located it. I don't know where God is in me, and so on. And very often God will reveal himself at that center. And I'd like to, with the help of this balloon, I would like to give an example, just one of many examples that can be given as to how God can reveal himself at the center of our being, deep within ourselves. I gave this experience, or wrote this experience, I think, in 2 of the books. And where I got the idea of illustrating it from, with a balloon, was from my own experience. So let's say for a moment that this is our self or consciousness, and it is open-ended. And one day, or say that normally we look in ourselves and we see nothing but ourselves. But then one day, God puts his mouth, you might say, to this center of consciousness, this open end, and infuses his life into consciousness or self. Well, can you imagine what such an experience would be like? It's like expanding. Talk about an expansion of consciousness. This is like expanding in all dimensions. And yet, I remember as a child when this happened, I actually looked at my arms and my feet to see if I was crawling. Because in itself, but obviously you're not, but it's very mysterious. And furthermore, it comes from someplace within yourself. And yet I knew that whatever this power, this infusion was, it was not myself. The air in the balloon is not the balloon. And then, of course, in time, you see, it all goes out. It seems to go away. But you'll never be the same again. I've often said, one glimpse of God will ruin your life, because you'll never be happy again with how things were before you had that glimpse, or before you had that experience. From now on, you're going in pursuit. So this is one little way, and there are many others, in which God lets his presence be known, his mystery. He gets us in pursuit of himself. And so let's say that now we have decided to dedicate our life to seeking God, seeking perfection, and so on. Now, one of the first things that we do will be in this pursuit will consist of a reformation of our life. That is usually the first step. We're going to really heed what Christ said, that unless you leave all and follow me, you cannot. Well, I'd forgotten what he said. Was inherit the kingdom of something? No, that wasn't it. Anyway, he said that you have to leave all in order to follow him. So here we are in this first step of after some conversion experience has turned it around, going in pursuit of God. And we're getting rid of everything in our life, throwing out everything in our life that we regard as distracting us from God, as what is less than perfect, as anything that interferes with the constant awareness of God. We want to always live in that presence of God, always live with that awareness of God. And in order to do that, we have to get rid of all those distractions, all those bad habits that keep us from becoming aware of God. And of course, God encourages us all the time with what I call sugar cubes. We find the first stages of the spiritual life, everybody does, exceedingly sweet, and we're very fervent. And that's because, you see, this ego all the time is being fed with, God's consolations and what I call, sugar cubes. And this really keeps us going. This is also a time which is a reformation of our life, throwing things out that don't belong, trying to become more perfect. It's also the ascetic stage of our life, where we're going to discipline ourselves. It's not easy to throw out bad habits, and we're going to discipline ourselves. We're going to take our life by the bootstrap, you might say, and to test our willpower. How far are we willing to give up everything for God? And this ascetic discipline, giving up all these comforts in life, going with less food, or giving up what we don't like to, eating what we don't like. There's just thousands of ways in which we are disciplining ourselves. It's like testing ourselves. We're doing that. And it's good, because this is going to tell us how strong we are, how weak we are, and we're going to fall and fail all the time, and we're going to have to learn to pick ourselves up by the bootstraps. Now, this whole reformation of self is what John of the Cross calls his first night, which is the night, or the active night of the senses. By active, he means what we're doing ourselves, what we can do ourselves to promote our own journey and to get closer to God. And so this demands discipline, and it is a challenge, and we take on a lot of religious practices to help ourselves, more hours of prayer, spiritual reading, you name it. I'm not going to spend much time on this active night of the senses, because most of our books are really, our market is, spiritual marketing is flooded with books at this stage of the journey, you see. But let us, and before we go on, let us say a word about what John of the Cross means by the passive night of the senses. Now, all this is God's withdrawing those sugar cubes, withdrawing his presence, withdrawing that sweetness, withdrawing that fervor, that ardor, and our energy tends to wane, you see, and we feel we're not getting any place, and we're left high and dry. Now, the notion of dryness in prayer is predicated on there first being the wetness, you might say. The water is there. The flowing of divine life is there. And then suddenly it's withdrawn, and now it's dry. So when we talk about dryness, we're talking about the absence of something that seemed to be there, at least in experience. So these periods of dryness seem to be when we're without God. There's an absence of God. A lot of people say, well, I've always lived my life in absence of God. That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about the night of the senses, or the dark nights, or even about the spiritual life. Before we can talk about any absence of God, we must first have experienced that presence. So in the passive night of the senses, there are periods of dryness. And I would say periods that become increasingly prolonged and increasingly deep and increasingly difficult to deal with. So, and that is the passive night, because we're not doing it ourselves. God is withdrawing that presence. We have no control over that. That's something, now God is beginning to act on the soul. We've been acting on ourselves all the time, and God's been acting too, but now God is going to really begin to take the soul in hand, you might say, and start to withdraw those sugar cubes. This is a tremendous test. Now the ego's really going to be challenged. Am I in this spiritual journey solely for my own pleasure, for the kicks I get out of it from God, for, my own wonderful self-image? The ego has a wonderful self-image of itself at this stage. Or am I really in this for God? So these drynesses, these periods of difficult dryness, are a marvelous time to get our priorities straight. Hey, we're in this for God. We're not just in it for what we get from God, we now want to give to God, our whole being. And we're grateful, we give it in gratitude, we give it in love, and we're determined that to be strong in this. And it is a real testing of the will, and to persevere, to endure, and to, let go all that self-gratification. God, let go of those sugar cubes. And what happens when we're in the same process is that, say that we've had to endure many hours or even days of a terrible dryness. You see, when God reappears, as it were, what has happened is we're meeting God on a more profound level than any of those sugar cubes ever gave us before. In other words, that meeting from this emptiness and dryness, that meeting is more glorious and more profound. It's on a deeper level. It's different. We're no longer on any kind of sweet level. We're getting into some real solid foods here. And it becomes, it's worth it. We just say, hey, dear Lord, take away all the sweetness. We say this in our fervor. Take away all the delights. We can say that because it's worth all the drynesses in the world to have this other experience that we've come upon, which is beyond all this sweetness. So at the same time God is withdrawing, what he's really drawing out is that ego self. We are going even deeper, you might say, than the ego. The ego is in some way beginning to be diminished. And that little peephole in the center has become more and more. But let us say now that we have done everything we possibly can in the reformation of our life, in self-discipline, in becoming as perfect as we can. Let's say we have done everything we could. Now, nobody ever really knows when they have done everything they can do. Who can sit back and say, well, I've done it all, there's no more I can do? Now, we really don't know that. And for a long time, we may think we have done as much as we can do. Then something else comes up, and then something else, and then something else. So we're never really sure when we have finally done all we can. But God knows. You see, God doesn't put up with mere repetition. Once we have been through this, that really been through it, then that's the end of it. Now we have to go through this. We're not just going to keep repeating this and this and this all the time. Because once we have really experienced the depths of joy, we really don't need to experience that again. We go on to another experience. Once we experience the depths of anguish, we don't need to repeat that. This repetition is pointless. And I have more to say on that. Maybe we can talk about that later. In fact, there's a whole lot more to be said right at this point. But we're going to take for granted that we have done as much as we can. And we have come to that little nice state in our life where we have endured all these drynesses. And now anytime we take our prayer, we can just sink into God's presence, and all is very nice. And we really do feel very one with God. We feel a certain oneness with God. And we're in actually a pretty good state of affairs when all of a sudden, one day, out of the blue, this happened. That whole center here, or this whole center here, this ego center simply falls away. And we'll just put it down here. And now we have an egoless condition. And initially, though, we tend to think, oh, well, this should be a state of bliss. You see, no ego anymore. But there's another side to this, and I have tried to put it into this. This is a tremendous shattering. You see, let me see if I can get that in here. Now you see all these rough edges here. I've got a bunch of rough edges sticking out here, and it is a kind of even though it's a clean breakthrough, it's gone, and in an instant, like that creative act, it's just gone. But we have been shattered, and painfully shattered. And I have a great deal to say about this experience. Let me, I think I put it in one of my books. In fact, I think that the path to no self opens up with this experience. And I was sitting in the garden one day reading. And I was in the monastery at the time. I was 17. And I was reading some book in front of me or trying to read. And all of a sudden, I felt like a cloud had come down and obscured my mind. A mist, a cloud, a veil, whatever you want to call it. And something happened that's kind of shrouded the mind. And that was it. And I knew something had happened, but I didn't know what. And when I looked back down at the pages in front of me in the book, I noticed I couldn't read. I could not read a single word. I could hardly see the spaces between these letters. It was like, Greek on the page. I could not read a single letter. It had nothing to do with vision or eyesight. And I found that out because that night at the Divine Office, which is chanted in Latin or said in Latin, you see, I don't understand that language anyway, so I didn't have any problem with it. But so something must have happened to the understanding. It has nothing to do with vision. But now that was just one. That's not the whole experience here, though. That's just what I noticed here, because a couple hours after this little event in the garden, I went into prayer. And it may interest you to know that the Discalced Carmelites for over 400 years have had 2 hours of silent prayer a day. 1 hour in the morning, 1 hour in the evening. Today people call it silent sitting. This has been going on in thousands of Catholic monasteries, Discalced Carmelite monasteries throughout the world for over 400 years, and probably before that. I don't know what the ancient Carmelite rule really was. But St. Teresa had these hours of prayer written in her, although the whole life is considered one of prayer. Nevertheless, the whole community is together sitting silently in front of the Blessed Sacrament for those 2 hours every day. So when I went in for the evening hour of prayer, I sat down, and as usual, I just, kind of focused inward to sink into this lovely presence of God. And what I saw was a big black hole in myself. So whatever happened, whatever this route happened, you see, at that moment I wasn't looking in at myself, I was looking outward. And that was the repercussion. Now, when I saw this black hole, and I saw it, a big gaping hole, where God had been, there was a big gaping hole. And this actually is indicative of this no ego experience. But of course there arose in me a great pain because of God's absence. And that is what is so very, very interesting about at least the reportage of the Christian experience. You see, offhand we would say, oh, well, this is wonderful. And then remember, this is self, just like all of this is self here. But it's just that little peephole, a real hole in the center, which is not self. And that little peephole is gone. So to here, now, you see, all this is self, and this is gone. But, so this empty center is two things at once. It is no ego self, and it is the positive presence, the presence of God. So the traditional reporting of this experience for the Christian is a dire predicament in which they experience that tremendous absence, painful absence of God. And yet we can see, not only is God not absent, God is far more there than ever before. John of the Cross says that the reason for this darkness or this black hole is due to an excess of light. It's like looking at the sun. You go blind. Everything will suddenly become dark. So not only John of the Cross, but even some of the early fathers said that darkness really means an excess of light. So, but what we immediately experience, of course, is the darkness, the emptiness. Many people say, Well, you see, basically it is good news because you see there's no self, and it's, no ego self. But in experience, we don't care anything about the loss of ourself. What we care about is the loss of God. In other words, we have come to a situation, that position in our life, where the loss of self is inconsequential, even the loss of the ego self. But the loss of God, which is what we seem to experience here initially, is, for the Christian anyway, that upsetting, that rather painful experience. So what do we do now? Well, in my experience, after I saw this dark hole, I didn't collapse, basically because at the age of 9, I also saw this dark hole. And God then reappeared after some 18 months. So to some extent, I was prepared for the experience. And by this time, you also know that even though you do not experience God, God is nevertheless still with you. You see, God cannot disappear. The only thing that could disappear is self, because God can never disappear. So I did not really want to look into that dark hole. It was very painful to me, that absence. And for about a week, I avoided any looking inward. You just want to look outward to avoid this empty center. But then I thought, I can't live this way anymore. And so I decided one day that I was going to look into this black hole in myself. And I thought, even if it should kill me, I should be frightened to death. No matter what I see, I'm going to look deep into it. It kind of took some guts on my part to do this. And so I made it my mind that during those 15 minutes we had before prayer, which in the monastery we call preparation for prayer, I would kneel down by the side of my bed and focus inward, really look into this hole. Now, this is to give you an idea of what I saw. Imagine that you're standing on the seashore looking out at the horizon, and you see a ship, silhouetted on the horizon. So you pick up your binoculars in order to see it better. You pick up your binoculars, and the minute you put it to your eyes, right on the other side is the eye of the captain. That's what I saw. I looked into this dark hole, and instantly there was this big eye looking back at me. It was a shock. It was a surprise. And yet I knew that was God, and it was wonderful. So I knew then that what I had to do was to keep looking into that hole. It's like saying that your eye has to grow accustomed to the dark so that you can see in the dark. In many ways, our journey is like constantly being able to see in the dark. And once you're able to see, then it goes dark again. Because we're really going deeper and deeper into that mystery of God, seeing God as God really is, and not on our own turf, our own terms, our own ground, but more and more on His own ground. So this also one of the unique changes that takes place between here and here. You see, in this situation with the ego self, this is a position of strength. No matter what happened in our lives, we could always pick ourselves up by the bootstrap. We always had this feeling within that no matter what goes wrong, you see, we can just start all over again and pick ourselves up and so forth. It's a position of a strong will. In this position, however, things have changed. We feel helpless. That strong will, that ability to pick ourselves up is just not there. And so this is a position where we experience our own helplessness. No matter, though our mind wants to, to carry on as usual, to behave as usual, nevertheless, the will, you might say, is not obeying. It's just not there. It has really been shattered. Now we refer to the reality of the unitive state, and this is the unitive state, or as best we can picture it in the with this use of this model. And this little red ring that I put around here is that deepest level of the unconscious self, which experiences God and is now experiences itself to be one with God. So, but that feeling of being one with God is not yet. I would say that just acclimating to this helpless situation is going to take us. In my own case, it was about 9 months worth of pain, you might say, getting used to this, looking deep in the center. And I'll talk about what the will is. In the unity state, we say that it's a union of wills. And remember we said that what that will is an energy. It's like a union of what one, I think it's Gregory Palamas or one of the other saints, he said he refers to created energy and uncreated energy. And so created energy, uncreated energy being God, created energy being our own will. And in the unity state, God unites them together. Now, in this state, we can no longer go where we want. Remember what Christ said, the day will come, he said to Peter, the day is going to come when you're no longer going to be able to go where you want. In other words, from now on, we can never, in other words, go away from God. From now on, we can only submit to God and let everything else go. So the benefit of this non-egoic state and this state is the stability of this state, whereby we can never go against God. Remember, the reason that the egoic state is unstable and fickle is because it still has that free will, that choice to go contrary to God. But in the unitive state, there is no such choice. I always say that man starts out with his free will, whereby he is free to do good or evil. In the unitive state, he is only free to do good. He is no longer free to do evil. And if there were no self at all, man has no freedom at all. He's neither free to do evil and he's no longer free to do good. He's simply out of a will completely. But in this state, the marvel of this state is that we're no longer free to go contrary to God. And so the unity state is God's pledge. It's like his covenant with us, which we didn't have here. You see, though we had pledged ourselves to God, this is now God's pledge to us, that we're never again going to go contrary to him. And this is the only basically stable form, the only balanced psyche we have. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But here we said we had, the situation was one of reformation. Here, however, we have a situation of transformation. Reformation is what we can do. Transformation is what only God can do. Now, this no ego is like having a bomb dropped in the center of us. And all our good reformative, in Reformation, you see, we remade ourselves according to how we thought we should be and act. Here, however, God has kind of shattered all that. We just kind of go to pieces, as it were. And when the dust settles, everything's going to be arranged not only around a divine center, which it was not here, the psyche or the empirical psyche anyway, was arranged around an ego center. Here it is arranged around a divine center, and only God knows how to arrange that. So when the dust settles, everything will be as it should be, not according as we made ourselves, but now as God has transformed us. So this is the process of transformation, and it really begins with no ego. Transformation does not really begin so long as the ego is around. Transformation only begins when that ego has fallen away. Now we have no choice but to let go, to submit, to submit everything to this center. Let it all go. And we have many concerns and so forth that we simply going to have to let go of, concerns we never thought that we had. We often feel we have let go of everything, when suddenly something else comes up and we figure, now we have to let go of that as well. So there's also a sense here. I know for 9 months, it will really take years to get fully adjusted to this condition. Remember, we have lived all our life in this condition. But now it's going to take quite a bit of living to adjust to this whole new condition. And once we're fully adjusted to this condition, we won't even remember what things were like here. Now you see, when we had, in this state here, in the egoic state, we may have had a glimpse, a passing, impermanent glimpse of what this state might be. And we thought, oh boy, we want to get there. That's perfection. That is the state I want to be in. But when we get there, it's actually a different story, because we're no longer experiencing it as we did in a glimpse here. For example, that which experienced God here, that ego which experienced God here, is gone. And that's why that way in which we experience God is no longer possible. We cannot experience God this way anymore, because that in ourselves, by which we previously experienced God, that is gone. Now we have to experience God on a whole different level of ourselves, a more profound level, a level that we never really suspected prior to the falling away of this ego center. So this entails a radical ontological change of consciousness. This isn't just a change of some content. Now we have some new ideas. This is a moving experiential change of consciousness. And in those first months afterwards, the only thing I wanted was peace, just some peace. Because all of this, the upheaval that this created, this bomb in the center of consciousness, was such that you just wanted to get down in that center, get to the bottom of that center. And sometimes I would touch that bottom, and then there was a sense of peace. And so once I found that it was possible, that there was a bottom of this empty center, there was a bottom where there was peace. I aimed for that all the time, trying to get to this peace. And once you get there, you stay there. While all of this is rising and trying to disrupt us. And remember also that the mind is still bending on itself, always bending on itself. This is how at first we were very aware of our own self-center, our own sense of being, always looking at this center in ourselves. We also were aware of this empty center, which is God within ourselves. And now the situation is different. The mind is still bending on itself, but now it sees an empty center, a dark center. And this knowing mind, seeing this empty hole, gives rise to an experience that I always thought of as the third eye, which seemed to be in the middle of the forehead. You see, there's no longer just the subject-object self, but there seems to be this eye here that seemed at times like light, that was very, very painful. If I put my two fingers right here, it was like the obliteration of all thought. It was, in a way, that contemplative gaze, a kind of enforced contemplative gaze, and that's a phenomena. It will go away, that phenomena. But that is a phenomena that we first experience here when we come to this unitive state. And remember, this shattering of the ego center is now that third dark night that John of the Cross describes, which is that dark night of the spirit. Here we have the night of the senses. This is, even though this is consciousness, nevertheless, we were actively reforming our consciousness, throwing out, getting rid of all those sensory amusements and pleasures, you might say, that distracted us from God, and focusing inward on our journey, focusing on God. Then there was God's action on us with those passive tests of dryness, and not only that, but some very passive experiences of God, wonderful experiences of God. But here now is this of the spirit, which means it has affected, you might say, not just consciousness, but to the depths of the soul. And we'll talk about that when we're get a little further along, the nature of between the soul and consciousness, because consciousness basically is a single term for what in the old days they called the faculties of the soul. And I'll go over this later on. So let me see. So there comes a time when we finally get to the bottom here and begin to enjoy some peace. And all these disruptive thoughts have to be ignored. All these emotions that seem to arise have to be ignored. And we have to let go and submit. We have to admit to our own helplessness. And we trust God now for everything. And what happens that in that whole process of letting go, of learning to trust God, you see, this psyche is becoming integrated around a new center, becoming, you might say, whole and well-balanced. And we have to learn to live without our usual sense of self, even the usual sense of the divine. We're going to meet the divine on a wholly different level now. It's a way, this is what we call the way of abandonment and trust. Now, the little flower, St. Therese, she's someone who particularly articulated what she calls the little way, which was a way of abandonment and trust. You don't really know what that means, I don't think, until you come to this state and you realize the extent of the abandonment. You want to get hold of your old self again, pick yourself up by the bootstraps, get back your old experience. It's not going to happen. This life, in many ways, that is finished. You're never going to get back. And also, as we begin to move through the journey, and we still have quite a ways to go, we're going to find out that it is irreversible. Once there is no ego, you never go back to a previous state. We are now have a very different consciousness and have come into a new state of consciousness, which we know as the unitive state. Now, and why do we call it the unitive state? And that's because on an unconscious level, now remember, this self-knowing, the knowing self is first and foremost unconscious, only secondarily conscious. And that's because in this continuous reflexing of the mind on itself, it now no longer only sees itself, but in that same process of bending and seeing itself, it sees God. So the reason it's called the unitive state is because we see God and self in the same, with the same consciousness, because consciousness is this reflective mechanism. We see God and self in the one same reflection. And not only on the conscious level, but on the unconscious level. St. Teresa once made a rather telling remark after she had come to this state. She said, I know that I am working for God and with God, even though I'm not aware of it. I believe that's the way she put it. And what she meant is that she knew on a deeper level, she was aware of God even on a deeper level, even though mentally she was not on a reflective level aware of God. So in this state, we are aware of God first and foremost on an unconscious level, and only secondarily on a reflective or conscious level, which means that whatever we do and we no longer have to almost focus within, because we have this permanent and abiding awareness, which we did not have in this state. In this state, or egoic state, we had to make a deliberate, conscious effort to be aware of God. In other words, we had to use this whole reflective consciousness. But here now, we're aware of God even without reflective consciousness, without looking within. And what is this experience? Let's say something about this experience and the difference between the two. Here we had a very strong sense of our own being. Even though we knew that God underlie it, God might have been in the center of it, nevertheless we had a sense of our own being. Here, however, this sense of our own being is replaced by a sense of God's being. It's as if we now recognize that at the center of our being is God's being. And it's for this reason that many people say, hey, look, my true self is no self, or my true self, and what they mean by that is my true self is no ego self. Or they say my true self is God, because God is now the deepest center of myself. Now that's what is meant. The self is not canceled. This also self is not identical with God, but it seems in experience it's a run-on with God. So this empty center, as we say, is not God. Is not self. It is what surrounds this empty center that is self. Also, it's very important to remember that we can only talk about a center if we have a circumference. We can only talk about God in ourselves, or God immanent. For God in ourselves means God immanent. Because it is relative. It's relative to this something outside. God is inside because we are outside, you might say. So consciousness is responsible for our whole sense of interiority, of an inside, of an immanent, and also of an outside, or a transcendent. Consciousness is responsible for this, and which goes to show you that consciousness is purely relative. God is relative to consciousness even. So anyway, let's see if we need to say something more about this. Oh yes, this third eye we were talking about, this third eye is really, we only notice it in the acclimation process, and remember the acclimation process may take years, and that is getting used to seeing an empty center, a dark center, seeing to the bottom of it, and then realizing that this is gone. And this third eye seems to be created by seeing this dark hole in ourselves. And something about this, and it is near ecstasy at times, this third eye, because it just seems to want to obliterate all our thoughts and just be silent, just to gaze. This is the eye. Who is it that said, this is the eye with which I see God? This third eye is the eye with which I see God. And it is the same eye with which God sees me. Remember in the experience I talked about looking into this hole and seeing God's eye? And there another saying goes, I know God even as I am known by God. And somebody even remarked, it's the same eye seeing itself. So we do find that this gaze at God and God's gaze at us, there is a certain little identity in that. Now, let us say that another comment that we can make about the true self. So now we are confronted with the notion of a true self here, which is very often what we call this divine center, and that's because God is the deepest center of ourselves, so we can say our true self is God. We also talked here about an ego self. We talked before about a false self, and even though there's no ego self, we still have left this whole empirical self, which we now realize is non-eternal, always subject to change, it is, I don't want to say it's irrelevant, but we suddenly realize that it is non-eternal. Now, I want to say something about what we call the unitive revelation. This, even though we now have this new awareness of God as the very center of our being, our deepest sense of being, we're not even concerned if we're have come to the unitive state or not. You know, when we go in pursuit of the contemplative life, we're not in pursuit of reaching some kind of state. It seems like today there's a great deal of concentration on reaching some kind of a state. But for the Christian contemplative, his whole life was just giving up of himself to God. And, you know, whatever states we pass through, we'll find, but reaching some kind of state, unless it's heaven, ultimately, it's not that relevant. So we're not really concerned about reaching some kind of unitive state. And even though we may have read a great deal about it, there's no ascertaining. We may never know, you know, if we're really there. And we leave it to God. If we're there, fine. If not, fine. It just doesn't matter. But there is what I call a unitive revelation. If we're ever going to know we're in that state, there must come what I call anyway, a unitive revelation. And this usually comes long after this initial breakthrough, or the ego self has fallen away. It comes after we have been totally acclimated to this state, and which is a very good state. And then comes the revelation, whereby we not only see this center in all its brilliance, know this as the unitive state, as our true oneness with God, and what the unitive state is all about. But at the same time, we see all the former illusions fall away about what we thought would be the unitive state. All those expectations we had of perfection, all in many ways we see, what we see now is the only thing transformed into God, the only thing that is one with God is our own deepest center. Somehow we were expecting the divinization or transformation of this whole empirical self. And so we spent a lot of time trying to perfect ourselves, which doesn't hurt. But true perfection and true transformation is only in the center. It is not really concerned here with what is outside of this center, or this center being both God being our center and being the center of ourself, where the one is a run-on with the other. So this is always a surprise, this revelation that God is my deepest self. And that all of this here, well, yeah, it's me, it's myself in a way, but it is an impermanent, non-eternal, and ultimately irrelevant. So we had been trying to change all this, and all that is not going to change. And we're going to talk about what we say when we say all that. But it's the deepest center of ourself that is one with God. So we were looking for it, looking for the unitive state in the wrong places. We were also looking for all this bliss and love and everything else. Whereas this unitive revelation, although it's very nice to see this, and we're talking about a seeing. When a contemplative says they see something, they also mean they know it. Whether I don't like the terms light, nevertheless, God can appear like a light. What I saw in this unitive revelation, it was like, you know, a little round circle, similar to that little host that we receive at communion. It's like the little round circle, that divine center in myself. And I knew that God was my deepest self. I also had the sense of a brand new beginning, of being a whole new person, of a new stature almost. And I really did see that person prior to really seeing this. That person was literally dead, gone forever, never resurrected. Don't ever expect the past to come back. But this now is the new person. So that's another aspect of the unity revelation. Another part, another very important aspect of this unity revelation, which we never hear about, is the realization that the interior or inward journey is over with. It is finished. For years and years we have been working on our interior life, going within ourselves. But now it is finished, because you cannot go deeper than the deepest. If you have any further to go, if there's any deeper aspect of yourself that you can penetrate or bump up against or anything else, then you haven't gone far enough. And it's not just meeting God at the center of yourself, but of this, you're aware of this whole permanency of this condition. And it is not just some passing state, where this is now where this was all egoic consciousness, because it was centered, consciousness was centered on the ego. This is now, the whole thing is the unity of consciousness, because all of consciousness is centered upon the divine center. That we are not on our own ground anymore, that we are on God's ground, and that what self is, that self really comes forth from this ground. It's almost like self is some kind of an emanation of this ground, even though we can see in reality, despite our, and let me make another very important point, an important point here, that despite all our experiences, what we experience, and we tend to base all our concepts and ideas and expectations, everything on experience, but reality and truth really is beyond our experiences. Experience represent as much as we can know within our human limits of the reality of what's taking place. We don't really know how God is joined together with ourselves, but we experience it. But the reality and truth of that is beyond us. We don't, in it, nothing shows up that the truth is really, in reality, is really beyond our experience, is the fact that when this ego first falls away, it seems like a seeming absence of God. That's our experience of it. Wherein, in fact, it is a great, marvelous presence of God, such as we've been inundated with the presence of God here, and yet we feel His absence. And that's because we no longer recognize God on our ground. Our ground, you see, our ground is an egoic ground. God's ground now has to be recognized on His own ground. We did not recognize God on His own ground, you might say. So that's why we initially experienced this darkness in the center of ourselves. We experienced our own nothingness. We took this for our own nothingness, and it is. Because this is not the self. This empty center is our nothingness. In a way, God turns out to be our nothingness. Our own personal nothingness, you might say. And God has replaced our own center. Now, let me see, something else another important point we want to bring out, not only about the unity state, but the whole of consciousness, the whole experience. You see, in the reflexive because of the reflexive mechanism, or the knowing self, this is always a dual. We always have this. This is what you might call a dual experience. There is a duality in the knowing self, and it's because of that that intellectual knowledge becomes possible. Because all intellectual knowledge or learning takes place because of this dialectical, this automatic duality created by consciousness itself. If we could not compare and contrast and associate, we wouldn't learn anything. So learning depends upon a duality. Learning depends upon relativity. And so the knowing self is what gives rise to the intellect, And it's always a dual. You know, there's always me and the other, and there's the body and the soul, and you name it, and there's all these opposites in here. And that's because the knowing self knows through a dualistic mechanism, which is the reflexive mechanism of the brain. But that the experience of the center is totally non-dual from beginning to the end of our journey. We don't have any compare and contrast here, or it's simply a non-dual. The center of consciousness and all its experience are non-dual. We can experience a variety of, say, emotions, but there's just that one emotion. It has a sense of and one sense of being, a singular sense of life. It is non-dual. So that is a point we want to also make out, that even though the center of consciousness is always non-dual, nevertheless, reflexive consciousness always sees that duality. If it's not my own image, then I not only see myself, but in the same reflexive mechanism, I also see God. So on a knowing level, the unitive state is, we might say it is dual, but on an experiential state, it is non-dual. There is a singular sense of self, that my deepest self is God. And even though God is obviously not self. And we'll say more about this when we get a little further in the journey. Now, something else given in this unitive revelation, and it is that, in fact, there's a great deal that comes with what I call the unitive revelation. And without this revelation, we really wouldn't know if we were in the unitive state or not. Some people seem to think that only some master guru or father confessor or somebody else can verify the fact we're in the unitive state. But they can't. If somebody said to us, oh, you're in the unitive state, well, you know, what are we going to say? Big deal. Or if we go and tell somebody else we're in the unitive state, well, what are they going to say? You know, congratulations, I guess. But so whether nobody outside ourselves can ever verify that we are in that unitive state or we are not, because whether they say so or not never makes it so, and they have no way of knowing. In other words, there may be some discerning souls around, but for ourselves, we wouldn't trust them. If we don't know it ourselves, and forget it. It's not going to do me any good if Father so-and-so or this guru knows I'm in the unitive state and I don't know. And he's telling me so. We may believe it for a while, but after that, we're going to have doubts. So the unitive state, that what I call the unitive revelation, is that certitude. A certitude that is never doubted, can be called into question. It is that knowing that we are in that unitive state. It's also, as I said, the knowledge that the inward journey is finished. You know what? We no longer have to reflect or use that whole reflective level of consciousness to make ourselves aware of God. We are automatically, spontaneously, unconsciously, always continuously aware of God. And that's what we wanted. We wanted to come to an irreversible state whereby nothing in the world could take our gaze off God. That we could never forget God, you might say. That we would then live spontaneously, as part of ourselves, we would live our whole lives with God. And that's what we're now able to do. So, something else about this unitive revelation, but before I go further with the unit revelation, let me point out some differences here between these two conditions here. Let me put them side by side and go over some of what we're going to notice after we come to the unitive state. We will notice some tremendous changes. We've already noticed some changes in the bending, the third eye, the being, our experience of being in existence. Now, but there are it's vast, the changes that have taken place. So let's give an example of one one thing, and I remember when I first noticed it, and of course, once we initially notice it and that becomes a permanent way of living, we don't notice it anymore. When something's brand new, we notice it, but then it becomes old hash, we don't notice it anymore. But this is a rather marvelous phenomenon. Now, let us take the scenario of saying that of some maybe a crisis in our life, or say that people have bashed us. Let's just pick out of a hat and say that somebody has vilified us, ruined our reputation, hates us, goes out of their way to persecute us, and it comes in like this, you see. In other words, the person is outside and it comes into consciousness. We hear what they say. We may, depending on what they've done, you see, we may actually feel in a variety of ways what they have done to us. But anyway, that comes in and we are very hurt. And the deeper it goes, the deeper that hurt goes. And it gets right here to the center of us. And it may cause us real pain, what's taking place. But what are we going to do with it? We're stuck. Now we have this pain, this hurt, this anxiety, this fear. We've got all these emotions caused by some situation in our life. And we're stuck with it. It rubs us, it rubs us the wrong way. It grates us. And it makes us angry. And what we usually do is we turn around and are going to, react to that. Bash the person, seek revenge, hate that person, or have all kinds of bad feelings for that person and so forth. Now I'm taking kind of a worse scenario here to give an example of how it goes, that we're stuck with our, we can very easily turn what was goodwill into ill will. We have bad feelings and so forth and behave on them. In other words, we're going to react towards somebody by hitting back, blaming, whatever it happens, whatever our reaction may be. Now let's take that same situation. Let's just reverse it. Let's take the same situation here. Now we've got the same crisis, people slandering us, belittling us, hating us, whatever it happens to be. And we hear it, and we come in, and of course we respond, we don't like it, and it gets hurtful, but as it goes deeper, all of a sudden, that hurt, that pain, whatever it is that we experience as a response to what has been done to us, you see, it hits this threshold, this little threshold, and stops. It's like I've often said, that one way to put it is that suddenly all this simply goes down the tubes. In other words, that vanishes. That pain, that fear, whatever it is, not only does it vanish, but better than that, when we come to this threshold, we meet up with God, and suddenly all that pain is changed into peace, a sense of well-being, that all is well. And then there's joy, actual joy, because we recognize, hey, look, that where it matters in life, nobody can hurt us. Nobody can take God away from us. And so this is a very different, and now you see, what happens is that when we turn around now, because of this peace, this realization of God within us, instead of turning around to get back at our neighbor, this hurt really dissolves into what you might call compassion. Actually feeling sorry for them because they are so upset. They are in such pain, evidently, what they think we did, or whether we did something or not. Hopefully there's nothing that we have not hurt our neighbor. On the other hand, very often we're going to offend our neighbor no matter. We can say what we think is the best thing in the world and they're still going to be hurt. At any rate, we nevertheless feel compassion for them. We're not gone is that any feelings that we might have had previously of revenge, of hating back. There is a sense of compassion, a calmness here, and we go out and do what we can about the situation. So that is an enormous difference between the egoic state and the unitive state. And we're going to find out a lot. This happens all the time. When anything, and let's take the opposite situation whereby we're given all kinds of good gifts and we're enjoying ourselves. In comes this enjoyment. In comes this love from others. This, they're thinking well of us and it causes us happiness. And all of a sudden it hits this threshold. And again, it just bumps into this peace of God, this joy of God. So we're no longer capable in the unitive state of the extremes, those extremities, what I call those passions here, of feelings, emotions. So our affective life has been totally altered because of this. And because of the unitive state, we now have a balanced psyche. This psyche here, the egoic state, we were not balanced because we could go from one extreme of emotional extreme and passion to another. Here, no extremes are permitted because once our feelings reach a certain threshold, that's it. They come to an end. And they either just stop and go no further, or they, as it were, bump into God, and they act kind of as a reminder of God's presence. That's why when some of the saints reached the unitive state, they actually went out and sought suffering. They really looked for problems because they realized this situation, that that the greater the problems, you see, the greater their awareness of God. The more that they had to put up with, the more they had to contact this center. The more that center, and it was revealed. You see, sometimes, as we said before, we're not always aware of God on the reflective level. But as soon as something comes inwards to us, good, bad, or indifferent, I shouldn't say indifferent because it has to reach a certain threshold point before it bumps into God. So the deeper it goes, at least in the initial unitive state, we're going to see we've got a lot of circles to go. So we're going beyond even this unitive state. And that's why we're no longer afraid of suffering because we know it's going to get so far, and we meet up with God. And so there's some other parts of this unitive revelation that are very, very important. We said now that the inward journey is finished, and somehow we never planned on that. Somehow we thought we would just rest contentedly in ourselves or go ever deeper into ourselves kind of for the rest of our life, and that this interior journey had no end or would only end in heaven. But suddenly we come upon this situation whereby, you see, it's finished, and we know it is finished, and that's part of the unitive revelation. Just as another part of it is that sense of a whole new person, that the old person is dead. There's a sense of a new beginning, an ending, and a brand new beginning. This is also part of that unitive revelation. And here there is definitely a sense of wholeness now. That in our oneness with God, we are no longer seeking, no longer desiring, no longer looking, because we now possess it. Takes place. Our experience of the center, we said, is of nothingness, emptiness, a void in ourselves, darkness, and so on. We also said that with the unity revelation, it is now light. It seems to be a light center in ourselves from then on. But then there is something else that is also experienced at the center, besides just the light. And I know, and here I would speak for myself, I experience this center as a flame, as a steady, quietly, continuous, perpetual flame. And this flame now affects us, and because like every flame, it wants to go outward. Now remember, we said that initially this whole journey is an inward journey until we come to the unitive state, at which time we can't go any deeper. The inward journey is finished. But then something happens. Then the whole journey turns around because of this living flame of love and goes outward. There is a thrust from the center outward, as if this flame wanted to be manifested. We want to do something with it. And this also is part of this unitive revelation. So what we have, the movement of the total journey is first inward and then outward. And this going outward is going to move us into what we call the marketplace stage of the journey. And we're going to talk about that, what that marketplace is. Now, for the first time in our lives, we really can be or afford to be fully human. Oddly enough, in this particular beginning egoic state, somehow we had the expectation that we were going to somehow become, well, divine or divinized and so forth. It's not that we were escaping our humanity, but it didn't. In other words, that was just not our goal. Let us put it that. Being human was just not our goal. It seems like we had begun, we couldn't help but be human. We'd begun as human beings, and so what? So now we wanted to be not only perfect human beings, but more or less divinized, some kind of transcendental being, you might say. So we never had as our goal being fully human, in a way. But once we come to the unitive state, there is no longer that fear of all the risks taken in life. And that's because nothing can take God away from us, and also nothing can add anything to us. What can anyone give us in this world that is greater than what we have already? You see, we say, well, so can give us love, and they can give us this and all that. But that's a nothing compared to what we already have. That we possess God. There is nothing greater than that. So nothing that the world can give us can add to this condition, this state, or add to God. And nothing that the world can take away from us with all its risk-taking and adventures and mingling with people, you might say. There's nothing they can take away from us, because the only thing that matters is God, and that they can't take away from us. So here it's like saying that now for the first time we can really afford to be just fully human. It's like saying, because now we know nothing can really happen to us. So there's also an insight here. Because of this tremendous flame of love, there's a tremendous desire to give something back to God for this marvelous possession. Here we were in a state of really receiving everything from God, and even in this beginning or adjusting to this no ego condition, we were also in a very receptive and passive condition, having to both accept ourselves, you might say, and accept our condition and letting go and so on. But now for the first time we're in a position to give, and we want to give back to God what we similar to the way in which we have received from Him. Now, few people have ever emphasized, I've never heard it emphasized, in any of our spiritual books or in anyone who speaks about the spiritual life, that love demands and requires equality. Let me repeat that. Love requires and even demands equality. Love is never satisfied if it is loved, if you are loved more than you love the other. That is not a satisfying position. Or if you love the other more than they do you, that is not a satisfying position. We want to feel that there is that equality of love, that you are loved just as much as you love, and that there is inequality here. So very often in this unitive state, there is this desire, realizing how much God loves us, or how much that we are loved by God. We want an equal exchange. We want not only to match God's love for us, but we want to give back to God as much as we have ever received from Him. If God just showers us with His graces and His presence, well, what are we doing for Him? What are we able to give back? So this is a particular predicament in the unitive state, when we have adjusted to it, when we have had that, what I call that unitive revelation, which is an insight, it is seeing, it is experiencing, and very important because this is, we said, the beginning of a whole new life. So what can we give to God? What can we possibly give back to God? And I was thinking of this in this predicament. And now the unitive state, to tell you what can be given back. In the unitive state, we are in a really very nice position of enjoying this center, of enjoying our oneness with God. And not on any superficial level, but a very profound joy. It is a very good state, let's face it. And we can just sink into that center. For example, prayer at this time when we have arrived, particularly after we have first arrived, or after we have adjusted to the unitive condition, we can sink kind of into this center, and we may have glimpses of totally no self at all. Not just no ego, but no self at all. We may have experiences of ecstasy. We are just in a position where we can just sink below or beyond all this empirical self. Is kind of like sinking in and sinking out. And this is at times of silence, times of prayer, and so forth. And this is a marvelous a state, you might say. But what can we give back to God? You know, for all this bliss, all this love, and so forth. And then I thought of Christ. You remember St. Paul says that Christ forfeited, as it were, even forfeited his divinity, his divine heavenly state, in order to be fully human, in order to become human, in order to be human. In other words, it demanded some forfeiture on the part of the divine Logos to become incarnate, to become a human being, to be with us and one with us. So, in the light of his forfeiture of his own divinity, as it were, it occurred to me that what I at least wanted to forfeit, to give back to God, was all the bliss, you know, to have no more bliss, to no ecstasy, no sinking into these nice states, to give up that whole sense of divinity. Now, you can never give up the unitive state itself, but you can give up all those, the good graces that seem to come with that state. And so I desired, at least, to forfeit and to surrender all that which you might call bliss. What in Christ, Paul said of Christ was divinity. Of course, he didn't really give up his divinity. But this is the situation here. And as I saw it, the best way to give to God is to serve God without getting anything back from it. To serve God not in bliss, but in naked faith. That is, without anything coming back to you, getting anything out of it, without, in a word, just with naked faith. So it means giving yourself unconditionally, which means not on any condition that you're going to get something back. Now, the ego, in the egoic consciousness, it is incapable of this type of giving. It may like to give this way, but it's incapable, because it is all it's giving is conditioned on its own state of getting something back. And otherwise, the ego, if it thought it wasn't going to get anything back, wouldn't do anything on an unselfish nature. So it's basically unselfish, because, and when I say get something back, I don't mean somebody's gratitude. I mean you're going to have a good feeling about yourself. When you go out and hand some money or food to somebody else, they may throw it in your face. Nevertheless, you have a good feeling about yourself. You're getting something back. You may pat yourself very subtly on the back for doing the right thing or the good thing. You're going to get something out of it. You know, this is that old hedonistic philosophy that questions whether a man ever does anything at all in his life in which he knows he's not going to get anything back. In fact, what he may get back is just being crucified. For all his efforts to be good, he may get back nothing but bad things happening to him, you see. But this is the requirement, demands of what we call unconditional love, whereby we're in the giving of ourselves away. Not only do we get nothing back, but as we're going to see, we're not even going to get that self back that we gave away. So now we want to start on that marketplace. Let us say that we have sacrificed all our bliss, have sacrificed all our nirvana, and in order to serve God selflessly for the first time in our lives, which means there's nothing in it for us. We're doing it all for God and nothing in it for us. Now, of ourselves, we just can't make that happen. We can't, in other words, to say, oh, well, we're just not going to experience any bliss anymore. After all, if that's given to us as a grace by God, we can't suddenly turn a valve off. We can't suddenly turn the grace off. That's all up to God. We are no longer our own boss here. Even though we are one and working in unison with God, God is the one who ultimately determines whether or not this can be done. So I know that in my own life, although I offered all this bliss and ecstasy and this sinking in, offered it all up, sincerely desired to have no more of it, and just to live in a state of naked faith. That did not happen for almost a year after that unitive revelation or more. And then one day, I knew that God intended for that to become a reality. Now, and so therefore, it's what I called in my book, going underground. And that meant you're living now here from the deepest center, the simplest center, living for and with God, but with none of the other experiences, you might say, of what is truly a marvelous state. So you're in a marvelous state, but have no experience of that. Something else to be said here. And let's say from this position, we may have a glimpse of what it would be like to be here. And we say, oh my goodness, this is a marvelous state. And we have all kinds of expectations of that particular condition. In fact, we may even think it's heaven here. But once we are really here, if we really get there and adjust to this condition, this is everyday consciousness. This isn't bliss or heaven. This is just everyday consciousness. So we want to point out that as we go through the journey, and we're going to be, you see, can they see these circles here? Okay. That we can see all these, we can almost see now what we're headed for. That every one of these, though, when we glimpse them ahead of time, seem to be rather ecstatic and so forth, but once we get there, it's common and ordinary. Furthermore, once we're fully established in any state, for example, once we are established here, we even forget what things were like here. We cannot recall, experientially at least, we cannot recall how things were in this state, because that which experienced it is gone. So this state cannot experience that state. By the same token, when we have arrived here, we can no longer experience, we hardly recall or remember what things were like here, because we can no longer experience this state. What experienced in this state is no longer here, you see. I've always said I would like to show the gradations of how this self moves from here to this state till ultimately what I call the fine line. This is what I call the fine line of the self. You see, how we move from here to here is very gradual. And I noticed in my own experience, I've always said, no two experiences were ever alike. They're always different, and that's because we're always changing. We are the ones who are moving, not God, but us. But something else I would point out is this, that the more fully human we are, the less we are. In other words, we diminish, as St. Paul said, I believe, Christ increases, we decrease. As we become more full of God, there is less, the more diminished the self is. To talk about this diminishing of the self is probably a psychologist's nightmare. But this is the way it goes, because they don't understand it. We can never, when we say more full of God, you have to understand, we can never have more or less of God. We can only have more or less of self. So as self falls away, there is, even though we say more of God, strictly speaking, there is just less and less self. So as consciousness, our human nature, which is the uniqueness of our human nature, the more it is filled with God, the more our humanity is filled, the less self there is. Now that's a paradox. I mean, most people, that's why I use the circles to try and to have some little model or way to show how that goes, that the self is fulfilled the more it is diminished. Let us take an example of how this goes in the marketplace, of how we get from here to here and then from here to here. Let us take some examples of this, you see. This is what is surprising about the marketplace stage. You see, we're giving here. Our giving away is virtually a giving away of self. We're going to give of ourself in such a way that we are never going to get it back. It's not just a matter of receiving some nice little reward, but we are never going to get that back. And we already went over it was. Some of those things we're not going to get back. Remember when we took the example between here and here, a certain crisis in life, our reaction to those crises, say people can't stand us, deriding us and persecuting us, let's say. We already talked about the difference between that experience here and that experience in the unitive state. Now let's carry on with that same experience. Let's say now that we have come here and all this derogatory stuff comes inside. It only has to come in this far, We may only feel a little uncomfortable before it hits that threshold and, as it were, disappears. Here, it had to go further. There was still, even though there's no suffering at the center, which is the worst suffering of all, there's no suffering in the deep sense. Nevertheless, there is some suffering and discomfiture and being upset until we arrive at that threshold. So we have to go in deeper in this state before coming to that threshold. Here, however, we don't have to come in so far. If something upsets us or causes us joy, you see, what we experienced here isn't there anymore. So we're only going this far, whether it's a disrupted desire or some emotion or whatever it happens to be, you see. This is that self that experienced it here. It's not going to that depths anymore. And let's say what happens when given that same situation, when we get to here. Look, this virtually comes in and hardly affects us at all. We are not responding. We are not experiencing as we did here because it is gone. So that aspect, that aspect of self, and remember, self is experience. It's all our emotions, our passions, it's our volitional will and desire and all these feelings, all these experiences. These are falling away. They're simply not there anymore. And it's not something we do. We're not suppressing anything. It's a fact that when we really give, say that we're going to endure something for God's sake. I certainly wouldn't endure it for anybody else's sake, even though we may be doing it in somebody else's name. We're only doing it first and foremost for God. If it helps our neighbor, fine. But the thing is, say we're going to endure something so that somebody else may be helped. So let's say that you're really going to make some big sacrifices in your life for the sake of somebody else. Well, you see, you're giving away some aspect of yourself, enduring some aspect, and you're not going to get that back. And there's much more to be said about this because it's very subtle. You see this when you experience the depths, say, of fear, or what can we say, dislike, I don't want to say hate. When we really fully experience not just an emotion, but some movement in ourselves, some caused perhaps by some crisis. Let's say we've been deprived of a child here. Once we have experienced that completely and deeply, do you know we can never experience it again? There's no repetition. The next time it happens, say you were to lose another child, sure, you're going to feel it. And people can say, well, I felt it just as much, but the fact is, they don't. You see, they have learned how to handle that. They have learned a great deal by handling that first bereavement. So they have learned they will never feel it or be quite as a loss as they were the first time. There's no repetition of any of our experiences, because once you have experienced something, just to go over it would be a complete waste. What's to be learned from it? There's nothing to be learned from a constant repetition of experiences. So therefore, once we have really experienced something deeply, we'll never experience that again. Now we can move on to something else that we've never experienced. That's why we have to, when we say we live fully, we mean that we have to accept we don't want to stay in some static situation. There are lots of other experiences in life that are waiting for us, that are waiting to challenge us. And so once we come to the unitive state, we really do become fearless in this matter. As I said before, the world can't give us anything that we don't already have, and it can't take away anything from us. So we become very fearless, and that's what this diminution of these circles means. It means that we have lived through all these situations in life fearlessly and accepting them. We didn't know, though, when we entered this marketplace, and it is a stage unto itself, we didn't know at the time that the only thing was, a lot of people think that the marketplace stage means a very altruistic turn or bent of our life. But let's face it, we were altruistic here. We were unselfish here. So the marketplace is not a state of some ultimate altruism where our only concern is other people. It is true, we have no more deep concerns for ourselves, because having God, we have no deeper concern for ourselves. What this marketplace, this going from, from here to here is about, what all this is about, what we call the marketplace state, is not about altruism. It's all a preparation for coming to here and ultimately going beyond self. It is a preparation for that. And it's actually a very difficult preparation. And I'd like to give you some kind of little example about this preparation. In this marketplace stage, we're able to live fearlessly, and we do have this flame of love for God, and we no longer need any gratification in it for ourselves. And it's not easy to live a life where there's no gratification in it for yourself. So any profound gratification, let's put it that way, because you've already got that happiness deep within yourself, your own oneness with God. But let us say that in this unitive state, we might depict the unitive state as a horse and a rider. I got this idea myself in the unitive state when having encountered this, being a youngster and liking horses, it seemed to me that I was just bucking and kicking and rearing, you see, and not, instead of being submissive to God. So this idea that the unitive state consists of a horse and a rider and obedient, the rider, the master, has had to tame us, and so that now he can ride us or be one with us. So let us look at that marketplace stage. The rider and the horse set out together, and they come to a treacherous stream, and the rider just says, well, we'll go on through, and the horse has hesitations and doubts and says, hey, look, I might slip, I might fall, this might happen. And the rider says, well, look, if you fall, I fall, because we're one. And so the horse goes across and makes it to the other side, and it's marvelous. And then they come to this big mountain, and the rider says, well, we'll just go straight up. And the horse says, well, I might fall over backwards. He said, well, if you fall, I fall. And so the horse says, I don't think I can do this, but he goes on and he does it, and he comes out whole and secure. And what happens in all these, now these are our situations in life whereby we're afraid to take these risks, afraid to open new doors, living life cautiously and so forth. That's not the marketplace. The marketplace is that we're really going out on a limb all the time. I always say go to the end of one road until it's a dead end, and then take some other road until that's a dead end, and just keep going. And above all, never repeat a scene. Don't keep going back and thinking that you can do this again. Some people stay in school forever. If their marriage breaks up, they go get another. I mean, let's go out for a more variety of experiences and see them to the end, though. Because this why we learn this rider and the horse, there comes a point whereby when that horse sees a big wave coming, he knows ahead of time that the rider's supposed to say jump it or dive into it or whatever. So that he knows ahead of time. He can kind of read the master's mind. He already knows the way, and it's the tough way. You might say it's the way of the cross in many ways. And yet, all the time, what you're gradually learning is that you always land on your feet. Even if you've been knocked down, no matter what happens, everything turns out in the end to be okay. But you gotta go through these fears. I don't say fear so much, but you have to trust to the point that when you come here, there cannot be a moment of hesitation, a moment of fear. There can't be any of this horse standing back saying no, and so on. There is such perfect trust that and that's all that this marketplace stage is about. It's coming. We thought we had perfect trust here because going through this experience was difficult enough. But we have to trust the whole rest of our life here to God. And there's no use talking about trust if we don't have a reason to trust. You have to be in a house, a burning house, before you can know what it's like to have to trust a fireman. So don't just sit in a comfortable house and say, well, I'm going to trust the fireman. Well, it's pointless. You know, you have to be, a target for somebody's gun before you can say, well, I trust the policeman or something, or trust something else to protect me, or even trust my bulletproof suit. Because if nobody's aiming at you, you're not in any position to be shot, then don't talk about trust, you see. We have to be in positions whereby that trust is tested constantly. And all of this is a preparation to come for living without self, going beyond self. So that's basically what the marketplace stage is about. And this tape is basically has already run over time. And so I'm pretty much, although there's so much more I have to say about the journey, perhaps in another tape, and perhaps if there's other people around to ask questions, or, we might be able to do some more. But for now, what we want to get down to is this fine line. And we want to talk about this no-self event. And remember, all the time, even here when we come to the fine line, that the mind consciousness is still bending on itself. And think of this, of all those darts and arrows of life that come in, you see, we've come to a point where they don't affect us at all. It's like water on a duck's back. We're already living without all that movement of will, without all that affective system, without all those desires. We're out of that already. We have gone far beyond that. So it's really this no self falling away, although it's going to be in itself, it is the simplest event in the world. And I have to say though that it does have some tremendous, it's not easy, basically. It's going to take a long acclimation to be able to live without it. But let's talk about that experience, that event, that's ultimate falling away of self. And perhaps the best way to put it is to now define and go back over what we mean by ecstasy, because in a way ecstasy is the vehicle that to some way is going to be the medium for crossing, I don't want to say crossing the line, nobody crosses the line, but for that ultimate falling away of self. So let's for a moment say what ecstasy is. We said, first of all, that consciousness was a reflexive mechanism plus a central energy. Ecstasy is a cessation of that. It is a cessation of the flow of this energy, which then stops the reflexive mechanism. So ecstasy is the cessation of the reflexive mechanism, and in order to have it stop, to cease, there has to be a flow of this energy, this central energy. Ecstasy really is an energy-less state. There seems to be no experience of energy in this state. And seemingly, when this first happened, or the first time that I had this experience, it was as if some giant hand had stopped my brain. Just stopped my brain. I mean, it really forcefully held it so it could not move. Now, the state that results because of that is very nice. Nobody's going to complain about that state that results, but we do find ourselves in a new dimension. The problem with ecstasy, though, is that from the beginning to the end of our journey, it is not permanent. By its very nature, by its very definition, ecstasy is impermanent. It's something that can or cannot happen, and it's not really that relevant to our journey. It doesn't matter, the journey goes on, whether you experience it or not, but it can be a good gauge of the journey, and I'll tell you why. In this state, ecstasy in this state can be very gentle. We no longer feel that we are held because there's less to hold. Here, there's a little less consciousness, you might say, than here. And thus there is less to suspend. And of course, we have made advancements in all areas. So ecstasy is more gentle, you might say, in this state. That cessation of, that stopping, you might say, when they say stop the mind, stop consciousness, and so forth. Now, let us say ecstasy here, you see. Well, it's going to be, it's very easy. It's not going to be this rather dramatic experience that it is, neither blissful or like being held. In other words, its supernaturalness becomes what seemed initially to be so supernatural, a phenomenon in itself. Here we take it with great ease, and that's because there's not so much to suspend. And think about ecstasy here. It's, it's just a step away from our ordinary consciousness. Now remember, ecstasy was far, far from our ordinary consciousness in this state. God had to stop all of this, suspend all of this, with all this central egoic energy. But look, all that has to be stopped here. You're hardly stopping anything. Ecstasy also means to go out, and it means to go out of self. With the cessation of consciousness or self, it seems that we're without self. We go without self. It's not that somebody else is going out of self. It's that suddenly we are without self. That's what ecstasy means. So when we experience ecstasy, we are temporarily, at least, without self. But what would it be like if it became a permanent state? For that to happen, there would be a permanent cessation of consciousness, permanent cessation of self, and thus we have no self. So, to go beyond self, and the journey, to some extent, this is the end of the journey. This going out of self, you might say, this loss, total loss of self. It's two steps. Remember earlier, it kind of always strikes me as a coincidence because we had two steps here as well. Remember, there was this cloud, the black hole within was rather a two-step thing. This also is two steps. First, it seems to be there. First of all, there is a cessation of the reflexive mechanism, which happens in every ecstasy. And that also means that we've stopped the flow of that energy, that particular energy that belongs to consciousness. That has been stopped. In other words, there's no more fuel in the machine, you might say. So that has been stopped. That is the first step. However, that can start up again. The reflexive mechanism can start up again once that fuel gets in there. So what has to happen for there to really be no self and no more ecstasy? What really has to happen before this can fall away is that energy. It can't just be stopped. That whole energy center has to disappear. No more. No more ecstasy, no more self, no more consciousness. So, the cessation of the reflexive mechanism, or you might call it no mind or stopping the mind, that's only the first step. For there really to be no self, there must be a going out, a total disappearance of that energy. Otherwise, it would just start right up. In other words, how can I say, this, I've always looked upon this situation going through the marketplace. Remember we said this was this flame of love that is virtually consuming us. We are being consumed. God is consuming us. And when there's nothing left to consume, say that God consumed this, burned it out. When there is nothing left to consume, then the flame goes out. The flame, after all, feeds on something. When there's nothing left to burn, the flame goes out. And that is the ultimate cessation of self. The flame is gone. That whole unitive center, which we experienced all our life, there is no center anymore. There is no center. There is no circumference. And that center that we experienced as life and being, God's life, that fire, that's gone. There's no experience of any life. There's no experience of any being. There's no experience of any interiority. You can't even look within now. You know, the only thing that ever looked within was the reflexive mechanism, was the mind, the knowing self. But when there's no knowing self remaining, you can never look within again. And there is no sense of, there's no experience of any withinness. And consequently, no experience of any withoutness. No experience of circumference or center. It is gone. So this is a tremendous event, this going out of this center here. It is perhaps, there's perhaps no greater learning event, because, you know, all our experiences are only worth what we learn from them. And the minute that that center disappears, we know without any question that there's not even a question that there's no experience of any self left. As I've said, it is, I've gone over that in my book, that experience. It is not an experience, it's not something that passes, it is simply an event. I want to make very clear the distinction between no ego and no self here, the falling away of self. Now, many people like to call when they hear about no ego, they immediately mistake it for no self. Or when people hear about no self, they immediately think that it means no ego. So with the help of these circles, I am showing you there's an enormous difference between the falling away of the self-center of consciousness and the falling away of the total, even divine center of consciousness. This falling away of self, which would be removing all of this, is very different than the falling away of the ego self. To some extent, it is to point that out. My books are about that, and in this taking this journey, I have tried to show that, to show the difference between the falling away of that ego center and the ultimate final falling away of all self, including the divine center. Now, the shock of the no self event has nothing to do with the falling away of self, the shock. It's the fact there's no God that's the shock. You see? It's much the same way as, remember the no ego event. In the no ego event, well, God didn't fall away. It was simply ourself that fell away. And yet we experienced that as if the absence of God. Here too, you see, even though it is self that falls away, nevertheless, without this circumference, without this center here, you see, we seem to be out of God. And that's because what experienced God as a center, this little red line that experienced God as its center, this mind that saw God as its center, you see, this has gone down. So now, as we said, there is no center anymore. That central energy went right out. And so we can talk about no ego on the one hand in this state, but in this state we have to talk about no unitive state, to some extent seemingly no God. So the shock of it isn't the falling away of self. We never cared about self at all, or self-preservation. That's been far gone. But you see, suddenly now where is God? Now you see, God is no longer relative. So and please understand me, we don't realize it, but throughout this whole journey here, our experience of God was totally relative to self. And not only that, but what I instantly knew, that what had fallen away was self, and that what I thought was God, or experienced as God, had only been myself. Now that's the shock of it all, and it is the truth of it all. In other words, all our experiences of God are experiences of ourself. They are our experiences of our own self. I do believe, however, that this little line here is a part of the psyche reserved to God alone, that can only be touched or acted upon by God. So now this is the discovery with the falling away of self. Not only is self, throughout this whole journey, not only is self the experiencer, but self was that experience itself. Bliss, ecstasy, rapture, all kinds of experiences we could talk about. Or just the presence of God, just the simple presence of God. That experience of being, even that fire of love. You see, that was ourself. We are that experience. And something else that's even more shocking is that because we are that experience, we also are that which we experienced. Now, that's very difficult for some people to understand. You see, as we go through life, we base our knowledge a great deal on our experiences. And so too, we base a lot of our knowledge of God on our experiences. We say God is love because we experience love. We say God is goodness because we experience goodness. So we base our knowledge and idea and our concepts on our experience of God. We base all this on our experiences of God. But let me give an analogy to see if you can understand it this way. Let us say that we are stuck by a needle. I've often given this in my talks. And we say we experienced the needle. Or say we were stuck by something and we didn't know what that something was. So the experience, of course, is our own. We are not only are we the experiencer, but we are that experience. If you feel a little prick or pain, that's you. That has nothing to do with the needle. Now, but we base our knowledge of the needle, say, also on our experience of it. We say it is sharp. We may say it is painful. We say it is fine or thin. So we get our real concept, at least as far as our experiences go, of what we experience. Some people, because of their experiences, have a great fear of needles. But in itself, what could be less harmless than just a needle by itself? But you see, it's your experience of it that gives you an idea of this needle and what it can do. So too, it is your experience of God that gives you an idea of God, what God is and what God can do, and so on and so forth. Thus, consciousness is three things at once. It is not only the experiencer, it is also the experience, and it is even that which it is the experienced, ED on the end of it. It is what we experience. Now, when I first saw this with the falling away of self, when this fell away, and I saw this, I was astounded. because I thought, to think that I have spent my whole life thinking I was loving God, experiencing God's presence and so on, when actually it was all only myself. I was only really loving myself, and I thought, hey, there's something that's wrong. By that I mean there's something else I don't know, because that could not have really been the case. And so God really gave me to understand that although what I experienced, definitely that sense of presence, that sense of other, all those experiences, it was just myself. Those experiences were all me. Nevertheless, God was the cause of it. God did touch us. Only that touch, like the needle touching us, you see, our experience of love and bliss, that was all us. But God was the cause of it. And also what we loved was not ourselves. What we did love was God. And so that to some extent clears it up. But that's a pretty shocking thing to learn. And in a way, I think we're grateful that we don't learn it until, the journey's over and finished with. People can argue about that. But there's a lot of things we don't see and really shouldn't see and are not prepared to see until the journey is over and done with. So, also we have learned, as we said, the nature of self, the total nature of self or conscious by its absence. We have learned what that is. We have learned what has stopped. We have learned all those experiences. We now know what made up the self and what it was, simply by its absence. Now, you don't know immediately following away as self. You're only going to know as you live day to day what is absent. Because what you experienced here or prior to the falling away as self, well, it doesn't matter if you were at home or out or in a crisis or whatever. Life goes on just as usual. But how you experience that, that's all gone. That is simply gone. So you know now, by its absence, what actually self was. And consequently, you know what it is. So, now I wanted to, before ending this, I wanted to say something about, we mentioned earlier that consciousness was in every way equivalent to what in the ancient philosophers and some of the early fathers of the church, even the scholastics, called those faculties of the soul. Many people seem to think that consciousness is the soul or something eternal, and therefore when they hear about no self, they're either frightened or they don't know what to think about it, confused. And that's, you see, people don't like the idea of no self because they don't know what it is. They have very wrong views of what self is. So therefore they can't deal with no self because they don't even know what it is. But let us talk about the self. What self is the faculties. What we mean by faculties of the soul, we mean its functioning. We mean that dynamic functioning of the soul. And if we define soul as the principle of life, well, there is no cessation of life. What there is, however, with the falling away of self, is a cessation of the experience of life. You see, self from beginning to end is experience. It is nothing else but experience. And when you don't have that experience there anymore, well, that's certainly not the end of life. Even if you didn't experience life anymore, life is still there. So consciousness was that experience of life and being, existence, passions, all that we experienced, you see. These were, as it were, experiences, you might say, of the soul, and now those experiences have ceased. Doesn't mean that the soul has ceased. Now, what were these faculties of the soul they talked about? One was the will, Remember? Remember we said that was the center, that the will is the center of consciousness. Remember, another faculty of the soul is what they call memory, but memory is not the appropriate word. It would mean remembering or remembrance, for which another word is mindfulness. If you look in your dictionary, you will find that one of the first definitions of remembrance means to be mindful of, to be aware of. So memory really means this reflexive mechanism. And if it were not for this dual knowing self or reflexive self, we could never have such a thing as we call the intellect. So those are the three faculties of the soul: the will, the intellect, and this mindfulness, this memory, as we say in the old terms. So, but those can cease. So what has ceases are simply the faculties of the soul, which means that functioning. And why? And that's because the soul has reached that stage whereby there is no further reason. The transformation is finished. That whole dynamic process of transformation, it's finished. And what it's been transformed into. And that is something else that we want to say here about that. So with the falling away of self, of course, the first big question that arises is, what is the true nature of this that remains? Obviously, the body remains, even though we really, without that center of gravity, we really do not have any experience of body per se, at least not as we did before. And also, it was responsible for that whole experience of soul and spirituality, interiority. That's all gone. So the question is, hey, this all remains at least, and what is this that remains? And that's the big question. And that is eventually what has to be revealed. And when we're ready, we go through a great deal before that even can be revealed. Some people keep saying, well, we won't get into that. Well, yes, it will. Some people keep saying, even though the self has fallen away, they'll say, well, now, who is talking, who remains, who this, who that? And I say to them, but there is no who. And then they'll keep going, but they don't hear it. They just could say, well, who said there was no, this kind of thing. So there's no getting around this. In other words, people are now asking questions. If you say there's no self, or right away they'll say, they'll ask you a question about self. You see, well, where is it, or something like this. So, because people are asking questions from this position, from the position of consciousness, and from the position of consciousness, frankly, as long as self remains, there's no way that one can really get a hold of that new dimension. And no self is a totally new dimension of existence. You just can't get that dimension. You may have a few glimpses, but those glimpses are not it. So there's no pacifying people who keep insisting upon, who insist on self. That's all you can do is what I have done to try and pacify them, and also to say what is true. And when they say, who knows, who this or who that, I always say, the body knows. If they say, to whom has God revealed now? I say, to the body. The body knows because it has a wisdom, that wisdom of the body, that man himself has never begun to penetrate. And there is truth to that. And I won't go into that now, what I mean, but the fact that the body knows, the wisdom of the body, this then brings us to that enormous mystery, central mystery of Christianity that we call resurrection. Because resurrection has to do totally with the body. You see, everybody expects the soul to be eternal. But the marvel of the resurrection is that nobody expects the body to be eternal. And so the resurrection, when we say the body knows, is very much linked to this, you see, to this revelation of resurrection, which is the central revelation of Christianity. regarding, you see, the reason that the resurrection is central to Christianity, because it reveals his divine nature. That has always been looked upon as a kind of a proof or an indication of his divine nature, the resurrection. And I would second that, because beyond self, the answer to what remains is Christ, and that, more than that, to say how that happens is really a bodily, really physical recognition, and I have a great deal more to say on that. Now, one of the reasons I never in any of my talks say anything else about this dimension beyond self, and that is because nobody would really understand it. Even though I think something could be said, using the few, little I've said has been so misunderstood that you kind of give up. Nevertheless, something more can be said about it. Now, my way of trying to say more about what goes on, or what exists, and all this beyond self, what we see, what is learned beyond self. For people to try and be able to, as a preliminary, to grasp this, I not only first give this talk about what self or consciousness is, so we can then put that aside, but my next is a series of talks called The Essence of Christian, it's a series of 4 talks that I call The Essence of Christian Mysticism, and I usually give it in a retreat setting, on a weekend setting. And this is because we have to be acquainted with the basic revelations, the essence of Christianity, which are mystical, or is mystical, and we have to be acquainted with that. And once we have this journey down, know what the self is, and get that out of the way, and once we are fully aware of how this journey basically is made within that Christian revelation, now we're prepared to talk about that mystery, which is no self, the death of Christ, the true nature of death, the only death experience anyone's going to experience. This is the end. It is finished, he said. And then comes that void of voids, that descent into hell. Then comes the resurrection. Then comes the ascension, another marvelous revelation. Then comes Pentecost. And finally, that marvelous Eucharist, which is, in a way, kind of another marketplace. You see, in this marketplace that we talked about earlier, you see, and in Christ's public life, Christ was historically, you see, was with us in the marketplace. But he was on the outside of us. We too, in the marketplace, are on the outside of one another. But you see, after that ascension to heaven, what the Eucharist is like Christ too being with us in the marketplace, only this time not outside us, but within us. You see, St. Augustine said, the Eucharist really would reveal all truth if we wanted to spend time on that. St. Augustine reminded us that when we eat food, that food is transformed into our body. But when we eat the bread of Christ, you see, we are transformed into Christ's body. This idea of eating, of consuming, this is very important, because we started this by talking about the different, our not knowing, our descending, how we came from God. But we do know how we go back to God and enter into God. How can something that is not God? Now you see, God cannot create himself. So anything God created is less than God. The universe and us, we're not God, because God cannot create himself. What God created is less than himself. So here we are outside God. Now, how is God going to get us back into himself? Well, think of that vegetable on the outside. We consume it and it becomes part of ourselves. God consumes us and we become part of God's own nature, his own essence. This is the ultimate transformation, what the early fathers of the church called, divination. So on this note, we want to end this this series of talks. And before, I just want finally to thank someone who made this tape possible. He sent me a donation to make the tape possible, and this is a Dr. Gerhard Kronbach of Austria. He is a professor of psychiatry at the University of Innsbruck and in clinical practice as well, a marvelous Catholic, making his own spiritual journey and trying to help others as well. So I want to thank you, Gerhard, for making this possible. I wish that it were a better tape without all these this terrible face you have to look at with all these grimaces, all the hesitations. I really should have read it from my notes. But anyway, at least you'll get this tape, and maybe I hope that you will enjoy that. Also in ending, we're going to end now, and I would like to play a little piece of a tape that Gerhard sent me from Austria. I am particularly fond of that, and thank him again for sending me this tape. He said he wasn't too sure of the name of the tape himself. It sounds like it was recorded, a congregation singing in one of these beautiful cathedrals, either in Austria or Germany, somewhere in Europe. And what they're singing is the Te Deum to God, Te Deum Laudamus, praise to God. And so that's a good way to end this, because we dedicate this talk and this journey to God. Thank you for watching.